another edition of the Draft Dynasty Podcast here on the Fans First Sports Network, the Pro Football Insiders. .com, as you can check out some of the new content over there. We'll have some of clips from today's show over there as well. And I've got Archie Wilson with me back in for a week here as Andrew Wilbar is out of town for a camp, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
That he is
looking forward to being back on with you, Betz.
We
it's
are
been a week
back
or two
to
now.
it,
So
Archie, and we're going to talk some second-year fantasy football
as a new
players.
rookie class comes in,
We talk about the rookies all the time. Obviously, every new year we talk about the mainstays and sleepers and all that. But we never really just kind of focus in on the second-year players. So I figured that would be a fun one as we roll into drafts here. Oh, man, and it's a super good class. I mean, it's just a really good group of players here. We could probably break this into multiple shows just with how many players there are. So we're going to kind of try to condense it here. And we're going to go by position, And, I mean, starting off, you've got 6 first-round quarterbacks that are all coming into 2025 as the unquestioned starters for their teams. It is a group that we got to see limited action of 2 of the guys, Michael Penix Jr. last year, and then also no participation out of J.J. McCarthy, who missed the whole entire season with an injury. So, but where do you start with this group other than Jaden Daniels? And what a rookie season he had at quarterback. Might be the best rookie season all time by an NFL quarterback. And then you go to fantasy and he finished as QB5. He had over 360 fantasy points. He was an elite passer. He was an elite rusher. And it's just one of those perfect storm scenarios where nobody could handle this guy. And so I wonder, as the NFL adapts a little bit to his game and defensive coordinators get a little smarter when they play Washington, and some of the issues that they have on their roster, does that affect Jaden Daniels this year? I'm still pretty high on him for fantasy, but I kind of feel like we saw the ceiling for him in fantasy already until maybe some things improve around him on that roster. All right. Yeah, I still like Jaden Daniels a lot this year. He's not up there with the Josh Allen's and Lamar Jackson's for me, I guess. But he's in that very, very next tier. He's still elite tier quarterback for fantasy, but just not quite up there with those guys for the second year for me based on the roster around him. So, but after Jaden Daniels, that's where things get interesting. That's where we have to choose kind of like who's next out of this second year group of quarterbacks that we want. You've got Caleb Williams, the first overall pick, who had a bad year by objectively. It was just not a good year for a first overall pick at quarterback. He's got maybe the best offensive mind in the game, though, as his head coach now, and a improved roster around him, including the offensive line. You've got Drake May, who was taken 3rd overall by the Patriots, and he is a guy who showed that he can run the ball. He's got a rushing floor and maybe a ceiling with that too, that improves his game. And a lot of the question marks we had about him, can he process NFL fields? Can he run on an NFL offense? Those are pretty much answered. So again, what's the talent look like around him? And then the other guy here is the guy who finished as the 6th ranked quarterback in fantasy last year. It's Bo Nix. This guy was incredible last year for fantasy football. There were a lot of yak yards in that discussion. There were a lot of things on the ground that he did with his legs. Some volatility you would expect from year to year with that style of play. Can he get a little bit more consistent? So let me open it up to you, Archie. If you had to pick one of these guys as your next quarterback off the board, if you're drafting second-year quarterbacks only for fantasy, which guy would you take?
Yeah, it's tough because you've obviously got that proven kind of relationship there with Bo Nix and Sean Payton that it works on the NFL level. Like we've seen it was efficient and it generated plenty of fantasy points. And I think Bo Nix kind of outshone what people thought he could be as an athlete at the NFL level with his legs. Everyone knew that he could read an offense and be a great game manager, which he did, and Sean Payton got the most out of him. But the rushing upside was what makes him quite an exciting fantasy option. But I think in terms of who I'd be leaning into, it is difficult because, as you said, Drake May, he kind of showed what he is at the NFL level. He showed that he's able to read defenses, and he was making plays for the Patriots in a team that was pretty abysmal around him, to be honest. And he was a top 7 rushing yards in terms of quarterbacks, or maybe even higher last year. So he's got the rushing upside. But I just really like the talent that Caleb Williams has as a player, and then what's around him. I think he's got so many weapons available to him. That offensive line looks like it could be pretty well rebuilt. And as you said, Ben Johnson being his head coach and play caller now, I think he's in a position to really take a jump. And I know a lot of people said it wasn't a great year for Caleb, and based off expectations of what we had coming out of USC, it wasn't. But I still think it definitely wasn't a train wreck, and he showed a lot of flashes in terms of what he could be at the next level. So I think giving him that environment, people forget he was a dual threat coming out of high school, I believe, to Oklahoma. So he's definitely got the ability to get some rushing yards, a few rushing touchdowns. So he's my guy for this year.
I'm really close on all 3 of these guys. Really, really close. It's splitting hairs for me because I believed in Drake May as like the QB1 in the class last year because I thought that he had the prototype size and could do most of the other things that Caleb Williams could do. And Jaden Daniels was not the guy for me. I thought that it was going to take some time for him to get rolling at the NFL level and that his size would be an issue, but he's so smart as a runner. And not to get back on him, but he was just so good last year. It's hard not to talk about him in this conversation. But I guess if I'm picking the next one here, let me throw this out to you. Caleb Williams, he had more rushing yards than Drake May. He didn't have any touchdowns, but he had 489 rushing yards. Now it took him 81 attempts to get there. And Drake May, it was only 54 attempts for him to get to 421. But Caleb Williams had the most rushing yards of any of the rookie quarterbacks last year other than Jaden Daniels. So that's a part of his game too. Again, just took him way more rushes to get there. So efficiency-wise, I do think Drake May's the guy. But Caleb Williams, if things go right for him as a passer, probably has the most upside to the passing yards. So it's really tight. And then Bo Nix is just Bo Nix. So I don't know where I'm going with this. I think you can't hardly go wrong. If you're going with one of these guys as your QB1 this year, then I don't know. You feel pretty comfortable with all 3 of them, I think. But no in 2 QB leagues, then these guys, their values just skyrocket. So it's a fun conversation. And then we can get to Michael Penix Jr. here real quick, along with JJ McCarthy. I think both of those guys could be serviceable fantasy quarterbacks, but you're probably not going to draft them this year. You're going to wait, and you're going to see what that looks like. You might add them on a waiver wire, or they might become streaming options later in the year. Is that kind of how you feel about those 2 guys?
Yeah, especially JJ McCarthy. He's one that I'm going to be watching the first few weeks of because he's in maybe one of the best NFL offenses with Kevin O'Connell as the play caller. And then what you saw, they turned Sam Darnold into, he was a fantasy relevant quarterback last year. He had MVP plaudits in the first few weeks of the season. So it's like JJ McCarthy has that same kind of talent that Sam Darnold had coming out of college, and if not more, in terms of rushing upside and things of that nature. So it'll just be interesting to see how, if he looks like a rookie because he didn't play any last year, or has he learned a lot just from sitting back and watching even though he's injured. So he's one of those guys, as you said, waiver wire, first 4 or 5 weeks, just keep an eye on it because he could be ready to explode, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the playmakers around him, really around both of these guys, but if you look at the playmakers around Michael Penix Jr., there's a lot of guys there that are exciting, and it's kind of like, how could he be bad? But he's just going to be a pocket passer. He's not going to provide you anything as a rusher. JJ McCarthy might provide you some things as a rusher. We'll see. But those two guys, it's going to be interesting to watch. All right, let's move on to the running backs here before we go take a break. And this is fun because, you had kind of like the surprise guy in Bucky Irving who came out of nowhere and was just a really good running back as a rookie for fantasy. And then let's see here. Outside of him, it was not great. And last year wasn't a great running back class for all intents and purposes. So if I'm missing anybody here, help me out. But I just don't see, like, it was Bucky Irving. It was, Tank Bigsby had a decent role last year. Ray Davis, there's just not much going on here.
I think there's a lot of handcuff
Tyrone Tracy
options
was okay.
in there. Yeah, a lot of handcuff options in there. But in terms of actual RB1, 2 types, that was Bucky Irving, and that was it really. And I think he kind of showed, in terms of his elusiveness and being able to break tackles, that he's up there with the best of them in the NFL at being able to create for himself. And I think he's going to be in another good offense that's behind a good offensive line. They've been known to run the ball, even with Liam Cohen leaving to the Jags. I assume that they'll have a fairly similar blueprint to what worked for Cohen and Mayfield last year. So I expect fairly similar numbers, if not more, for Bucky, because he'll be the number 1 starter coming into week 1.
Yeah, he will. He will. And then beyond him, it's like, again, you said a bunch of handcuffs. It's guys that you're like, where do we find the role? Can they fill a specific role? Can Tyrone Tracy kind of be like the receiving back there for the Giants? But, Scattaboo has shown that he can do that type of work as well. And then, it's just outside of Bucky Irving, it's kind of a wash there at running back. You feel a lot better about the rookie class in 2025 probably overall than you do about the 2024 class that is now in their sophomore season.
Yeah, not a lot of depth. I think really the only other relevant name to me was Tyrone Tracy, as you said. He looked like he was going to be a fairly solid contributor at fantasy level last year as a rookie, and he was, but this year they've invested in Cam Scatterboo, and he's kind of a culture shifter. Even though he was a 3rd round pick, I believe, he's one of those guys that the team's just going to feed off the energy, giving him the ball more and more. So I think as the season kind of prolongs, it gets colder, he's going to be the guy that gets the ball down the stretch, and he'll be RB1 by mid-season, I'd say. Yeah,
probably. And he might not be explosive, but he's a workhorse body, right? And we'll see how that plays out. Yeah, volume guy, absolutely. Here's the other name that I think is worth stashing as like more than a handcuff, and it's Tank Bigsby, because by the end of the season last year, he had kind of taken over that backfield. And now I know that they're like, no, Travis Etienne is our RB1 here. Liam Cohen said that, but words is words, right? Until we see it on the field. So Tank Bigsby, I mean, with a name like that, he's got to be a good player, right? But just in like actual reality for fantasy, I think that he's going to be relevant and somebody worthy of a flyer in the mid rounds of your draft. So, any other thoughts on the running backs before we go to break?
No, not really. I'm good there.
All right, let's do it. We'll take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll get to the wide receivers and tight ends, second-year players for 2025. Don't go anywhere. The Draft Dynasty Podcast will be right back after this. And welcome back to the Draft Dynasty Podcast. It's Jeremy Betz here with you, and Archie Wilson joining me from afar. We are recording late on a Thursday night, and you'll get this on Friday, wherever you get your podcast. Like, subscribe, share, comment, give a good review, whatever app you're using, whatever format, do the thing that gets this show and the Fans First Sports Network a little bit more exposure out there. We appreciate it. We love our listeners, and we want to hear from you. So, Archie, let's get into some more second-year players here. Let's dive into the wide receiver group, and this is where things get fun again. The running backs, not so much. The quarterbacks were a lot of fun. The wide receivers, these guys are fun. The highest scoring rookie wide receiver in fantasy last year was Brian Thomas Jr. for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Objectively, the Jaguars are a better team this year than they were last year. I mean, there's really no argument there on the offensive side of the ball that they are probably better schematically. They're probably better on the offensive line. And even though it's not great on the offensive line, potentially, Trevor Lawrence is going to get a little bit of a boost this year from the offense that they're playing in. Travis Hunter's there at wide receiver 2. It's just going to be a better situation. Brian Thomas Jr. set up for fantastic success this year. Malik Neighbors finished as the 6th ranked wide receiver in fantasy last year as a rookie. And he's just an all-world type receiver. He's probably right now a better real-life player than fantasy player because of the quarterback situation and some of the other issues with the Giants. But let's start with those two guys. If you had to pick one for this year, and maybe I just set up the answer to this question, if you had to pick one of those guys for this year, which one are you taking?
Yeah, I think it's Brian Thomas, and it's not a talent thing because, as you said, Malik Neighbors is an absolute stud. But in terms of what Brian Thomas has around him, even though they've got Travis Hunter coming in, he's going to not be playing 100% of the snaps or a bulk of the snaps like Brian Thomas is, because he's going to be playing a bit of defense as well. But I think the fact that even though you've got that two-headed monster now at receiver, Liam Cohen has shown that he knows how to operate with two alphas and get them the ball plenty. So I think you could see something similar to what the Buccaneers had last year with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans basically tearing up the fantasy league for the first few weeks of the season. You could see something like that, very similar. And I think Brian Thomas, he potentially going to expand his route tree. I believe I heard him talking about on a sideline interview during the weekend. So I think you're going to see a bit more out of him. You might see similar production, but I think you're going to see a higher level of performance. So he's the guy I'm buying there. And just to touch on Malik Neighbors quickly, I mean, Dabo obviously loves him. He was force-feeding him the ball last year. The biggest worry for me is that, even as a Steelers fan, I saw this last year, is Russell Wilson doesn't throw over the middle of the field. And while Malik Neighbors is so good, he can do a lot of his damage over the middle, out of the slot. And he's not necessarily that big X receiver. He can play X because he's that talented, but he's not that big body that Russell Wilson's loved all his career, the deep threat to throw the moon ball to. So that's probably the biggest worry, is that how that chemistry will work between a quarterback and receiver. I mean, last year they were just able to force in the ball, but in terms of having Russ there this year, I don't know if that's going to be as possible.
Yeah, and I mean, there's always the scenario where Russ gets pulled after week 4 because they're not winning and they just want to get a look at Jackson Dart. I mean, there's a world where that happens. Or Russ is old, man. I mean, he might not make it the whole season health wise. And so you got Jameis Winston there. You've got just a hodgepodge of quarterbacks that I don't feel great about from Malik Neighbors. Again, nothing against Malik Neighbors. I think if you just lined up these guys right now, and we'll get to a couple of the other marquee names here in a second, and you just had to pick one out of a lineup that you're like, yeah, that's who I want as my receiver, it's probably Malik Neighbors. He's just that skilled. Yeah. He's Jamar Chase, body type, skill set. I mean, it's all the things that you want. He's an incredible player. So nothing against him. It's just situation-wise, I just can't get on board with it as well. And then you get down the list here. Ladd McConkey was incredible last year at wide receiver as a rookie. Wide receiver 13. He had 240.9 PPR fantasy points last year. He's still the unquestioned wide receiver 1 on his team. They're moving him inside and outside. They are setting up this offense, this passing game around him. He's going to get a lot of looks this year again. And then you've got the guy that everybody touted as can't miss prospect. He's the best wide receiver we've scouted in decades. Marvin Harrison Jr. is just going to come in and be an insane top 5 wide receiver from day one. Didn't quite work out that way, but he was still really good last year. If you just kind of look at it from just a numbers perspective, outside of the expectations, but he finished as wide receiver 30. He had nearly 900 yards receiving. He had 116 targets, though. You can work with that, right? He just needs to be a little bit more efficient. They need to utilize him a little bit better. If you had to pick one of those two guys to kind of be the next tier of year two wide receivers, which guy are you taking there?
Yeah. I mean, I was in the same boat in terms of Marv coming out of Ohio State. I was in awe of the prospect that he was. So I've definitely not given up on him, but it kind of relates back to the Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas situation. You might have the more talented receiver being the guy that you pass out of the two, because Lad McConkey, he is the featured player in that offense. He's in a position that he could very easily become a top 10 fantasy wide receiver this year. He'll get moved all around. They'll match up a hunt for him. They'll get him matched up on some slot corners that can't handle his route running. And he's got Justin Herbert as his quarterback, who, even if he's not winning playoff games, he certainly produces a whole lot of points, a whole lot of yards, throws plenty of touchdowns. So there's production there to be had from McConkey as Herbert's guy. And then when you talk about Marv, I think mercurial talent. The chemistry with Kyler last year was definitely off. I'm not sure what was happening there, but I think that's more on Kyler's end rather than Marvin's end. I think you put him in a situation that you find Brian Thomas in, or that Lad McConkey's in, and he looks like the all-world talent that we all thought he could be. So once again, I'm going Lad just because of the situation.
Yeah, situation's key, man. It is. Target share is key. Lad McConkey's going right now as wide receiver 11. Marvin Harrison Jr. as wide receiver 18. If you're talking like draft value, the conversation gets a little bit more interesting. Like the upside for both guys is like top 10 wide receiver in fantasy, maybe even top 5. So value wise, you could convince me in an argument saying, well, for the price point that I'm paying, I'd rather pay the discount price for Marvin Harrison Jr. than the elevated close to top 10 price that I'm going to have to pay at a position for Lad McConkey. So, that plays into this a little bit. But if you're just talking straight numbers, I think that scenario-wise, situation-wise, yeah, that's the guy you go with is Lad McConkey here. And, I broke these guys up into a couple tiers here. Xavier Worthy is right behind Marvin Harrison Jr. in total production last year, and he's got Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback, right? So this is a guy who's going to have a big role this year in this Chiefs offense, and I think that there's a world where he could go off as a kind of a boomer bust weekly player, but when he booms, it's just like enough to keep him in the mix as like a top 15 receiver on the regular, top 20 receiver on the regular. Roma Dunze going into his second year is a lot of fun to consider there with this offense. And then I'm going to throw a guy out at you from nowhere because I love the quarterback. We talked about him already. Pop Douglas, Demario Douglas in New England. How much run does he get? He finished in ahead of Roma Dunze in the rankings last year. Or in the stats last year. So those four guys are interesting to me.
Yeah, there's just an abundance of talent in this sophomore class of wide receivers. It's just so exciting. I think in terms of Rome, he was another one like Marv. I think his stats didn't kind of portray how decent of a season he kind of had. I think it was kind of overblown how poor the community thought he might have been, and he's obviously got the physical traits. He's a great contested catcher. I just think that Bears environment last year, it was tough to thrive in, and I think that was shown across the board. So it's another guy that I would expect to take another jump from where he was last year, and that's not just as a player on the field, but that's also from a fantasy standpoint. Xavier Worthy, as you said, he's boom or bust. He could get 2 catches in a game, go for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. The interesting thing will be how does his role shift with the reintroduction of Rashee Rice, because I think Rice is definitely wide receiver 1 there, and he seems to be the guy that's going to get a lot of kind of the force-fed targets that Travis Kelce got during his prime years with Mahomes. So I think you're going to see a lot of Rice, but in terms of there could be some suspension there for Rice, I believe, maybe after week 4 or so. So we'll see about then. So that's kind of when Xavier Worthy's going to be really fantasy relevant, because then he's the unquestioned wide receiver 1. Pop Douglas.
It might be worth it to.
Oh yeah.
I was just gonna say it might be worth it to draft him and stash him in that case as like your third or fourth wide receiver. Maybe rotate him in on the flex spot, and then once Rashee Rice goes out and he becomes the number one there for a little while, things could really pop. I did want to give a stat on him real quick before you talk about the other guys. To close out the season, over the last 4 games that he played, he averaged double-digit reception or double-digit targets, and he was catching the ball. He averaged 6.5 catches per game over the last 4 games of the season. So he was utilized a lot towards the end. He scored in the last 3 games 19.6 fantasy points, 20.5 fantasy points, 22.9 fantasy points. That's easily very usable fantasy production, if you will, from him.
Yeah, I think he kind of proved a lot of people wrong with his ball skills. Everyone just said he was a flyer, but towards the end of the season, he was climbing the ladder, taking contested catches, plenty of catches over the middle while getting hit at the same time. So he showed a lot of versatility there, that he's not just a burner. And then, talking about Pop Douglas, he's one of those guys that he's in a room that's pretty much wide open. I know they've got Stephon Diggs there, but they're not married to Diggs, if you know what I mean. Like, he's going to be the guy that gets action early on, but if it's not going well, he's not the guy that they're building around for the future. So I think Douglas is going to get a lot of opportunity. He'll be competing with the likes of Kyle Williams there, who I think is going to potentially be a sleeper potentially for rookie wide receivers this year. So yeah, that's where I kind of sit on that group. And there was one more I forgot.
It's okay. I had just mentioned where'd he go here? I had mentioned I think that was it.
Okay.
I think that was it that I had mentioned. You've got Jalen McMillan in this conversation. You've got Xavier Leggett. You've got Kayshon Boutte, Andre Yoshivas. I mean, there's guys down this list. Keon Coleman in Buffalo. That's an interesting one. He did not have a good year last year from a fantasy perspective, but he's got talent, and he plays with Josh Allen, so it is what it is. But maybe one of those guys that we chat about there comes up and becomes a usable fantasy asset. But for now, those are the guys that we're looking at. And then to wrap things up here, Archie, let's have a Brock Bowers conversation. And I mean, he was really the only rookie tight end that was any good last year for fantasy. And I know you've got a few guys this year that are going to jump into that category as like number 1 tight ends on their roster. But how much do we believe in their ability to produce? Brenton Strange for the Jaguars. You had Jatavian Sanders for Carolina, Theo Johnson for the Giants. Those are kind of like the 3 names that were fantasy relevant to a degree by the end of the season last year. But Mr. Fantasy tight end himself, Brock Bowers, going into year 2 for a Raiders team that now has Geno Smith at quarterback and some stability at coaching, a fairly good offensive line, a good running back, and he's the number 1 target there in Las Vegas. I just think that, man, what's the ceiling for this guy? Is it like wide receiver 1 type numbers from the tight end spot? I mean, is he that valuable for fantasy this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue he definitely could be up there with the top 3 or 4 wide receivers, up there with maybe not quite Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson levels, but certainly right there and amongst the group. He is wide receiver 1 basically for the Raiders this year. He's going to see a lot of the ball. They're going to manufacture a lot of touches for him, and we've kind of spoken about this, but I feel it's going to be a rather unorthodox offense that is going to be tough to play because your number 2, your best weapons are your tight end and your running back. And that's no slate on Jacoby Myers because he's a good NFL pro. But in terms of game changers, it's tight end and running back, which is kind of an interesting combination that we haven't seen for a while, especially in the modern NFL. Most teams strive to have one of those elite wide receivers as their number 1 pass catcher. So I think, he's far and away the best tight end in fantasy, already in his 2nd year. And I don't think it's that close. I think the next name off the board would be Trey McBride. But aside from that, there's no one really in the same stratosphere as Bowers. So when you talk about him, he's got an unbelievably high ceiling and even just about as high as a floor because he's going to see so much of the ball. But yeah, those kind of my thoughts on Brock.
He finished last year. He would have finished as wide receiver 9
Yeah.
in fantasy with 262.7 PPR fantasy points. Trey McBride had 249.8. George Kittle had 236.6. And Jonnu Smith, who's now in a timeshare in Pittsburgh at tight end, had 222.3. Those were the only 4 tight ends that had 200-plus fantasy points. Brock Bowers had almost 20 points more than the next closest, which was Trey McBride. Now, Trey McBride had 2 touchdowns last year. Didn't have a touchdown until the next to last week of the season. I expect some positive regression there for him.
Yep.
George Kittle's another year older, but he's the number 1 target in his offense. So those are the 3 guys to me that are like at the top tier. But I think Bowers probably separates himself this year, just as a weapon, as the use in this offense. It could start a little slower, maybe, if you were like just trying to find some nitpicking potential issues, because it's a new offensive coordinator, it's a new quarterback, it's a new system. Everything's new over there, right? So maybe that plays into a little bit of a slow start. But I thought that last year, I wasn't a big fan of what they had last year, and he went off crazy. I was like, I don't know if I'm going after Brock Bowers this year when I was drafting last year, and because of how bad the situation was, and he just was that good. So he's going to be that good again this year. The ceiling is absolutely like a scoring like a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy, pushing 300 fantasy points. Travis Kelce in his prime type numbers, right? First round pick, worthy type stuff from the tight end spot. I would spend almost any second round pick on him over somebody else that's there, running back or wide receiver wise, if I have the opportunity to, and that's where he's going right now.
Yeah, I think the most exciting part is everyone knew the talent about Brock Bowers, but it was the situation. And this year he's gone from having a rookie season that was historic for tight ends from an on-the-field standpoint and a fantasy standpoint, and he had backup quarterbacks throwing him the ball. This year he's got a top 15 guy. Many could argue about Geno. So he's got a better offensive mind, head coach. He's got the quarterback, and he's just got another year in the league. So whether he gets a lot more attention will be interesting. But the tough thing is how do you give way more attention to a tight end? It's different to how the league doubles up on receivers, just because he'll be through the middle, he'll be out the slot. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting for sure, but I don't see a lot of regression. And if anything, just because of the ecosystem, you'd think he could take another step forward, as you said, into that top 5 kind of wide receiver group.
Yeah, I'm excited for him. I'm trying to get him on as many rosters as I can this year, because I just think he's going to be that dynamic and that good. But a lot of other people have the same idea, so it's hard to get him on your roster. It just is. So you have to catch him at the turn, really, of round 1 and 2 if you want a chance.
Exactly.
So yeah, you've got to be picking close to last in the first round of your draft there. So Archie, fun stuff. I think that, when you look at this second year group of players, they're going to make or break a lot of fantasy rosters this year. I mean, they're going to be leaders, like championship push type players for your fantasy rosters. And I think that you could feel very comfortable having multiple of these guys on your roster at a time and feel like you've got a really good fantasy roster going for you. And, that's not always the case out of a sophomore class in the NFL, but a lot of playmakers came out in last year's draft, and a lot of them have major roles this year. So looking forward to it. We've got a fantasy draft coming up a little bit later before the season starts. So that's going to be a lot of fun. More details to come on that for you, Archie. But we will give some results of that maybe on this show and talk about it again some other time. We'll have you on again as soon as we can. So appreciate you coming on. Plug a little bit of what you got coming up, whether that's written or otherwise.
Yeah, no, so just same for me, covering the Steelers on the Steel Curtain Network. Got a few series coming out for the new season, so just keep an eye out on there. And as I normally say on here, I've got a bit of English Premier League with that season starting to kick back off, so I'm covering Chelsea. So, yeah, that's basically it for me, but other than that, appreciate you having me on again, Betz. Good to be on, talk about some of the sophomores, because we haven't really had that discussion too much this year, and it's probably the most exciting class we've had in a while of sophomores in terms of the quarterbacks and wide receivers. So it's going to be exciting.
Yeah, and next year we'll have to do it again, and we'll be talking a lot about the running backs, I think, next year. So,
Indeed.
All right, good stuff. Thanks again, Archie, for joining me. Thank you all for tuning in. If you're listening to this show on Apple or Spotify or YouTube or wherever, again, please like, subscribe, share, comment, all the good things that you can to help us out. We would appreciate it. Until next time, keep drafting, everybody.